Hi, everybody. Welcome to our webinar today. I just unmuted the microphones if you want to go ahead and remute yourselves, but that way you can talk if you'd like it during any time or ask any questions. Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Vicki Moritz Henry, and I am head of training with Supermoms. And I'm here today to talk to you about the presentation that I had the amazing opportunity to present at Dreamforce this year. So just a little background, this was my first Dreamforce that I was going to, and it was just amazing to be able to present this and to be able to talk about the partnership and the work we've done alongside Thomas Pocklington Trust, which I'll tell you about in a moment. But it was a really special experience, and I'm glad to be able to come back and share it all with you now if you weren't able to make it there yourselves. So I'll hop right into it. So my presentation is entitled Be an Accessibility Ally, Building Accessibility into Your Org and Training. And of course, with anything in Dreamforce or with Salesforce, we see this forward-looking statement a lot. It basically just means not to make any purchasing decisions based on things that might be said in this presentation, and to only make them through a Salesforce information that they provide on their website. So we won't really be talking about any of that here, but just as a throwback to Dreamforce and all of those that we saw there. So being an accessibility ally, this is something that's very close to my part. It was one of my passion projects coming through, and I'm here today to share some of the tips. So we're going to go through all 5 of these tips. Number 1 being narrate your demos. Number 2, don't forget the alt text. Number 3, format accessibly. Number 4, keep your page layouts intuitive. And number 5, test your design. So who here has heard about accessibility before or has an idea of what accessibility means? That's no problem. I probably would have said the same thing or had the same silence about a year ago. So, oh, sorry, I'm here to share my findings about accessibility and what I discovered as well. So to give you some background, I think it's always important to start off with the story of where this project came from and why it is something that's so important to me and to the Supermoms program. So it all goes back to the partnership that started it all. So we at Supermoms are a training program, and we're all about getting moms and dads into Salesforce and using Salesforce to upskill and to empower them to find flexible and well-paid careers in the Salesforce ecosystem. So we do all online training and virtual training programs that combine training and work experience to be able to upskill. And Thomas Pocklington Trust is a nonprofit organization that works with the blind and visually impaired to be able to find jobs and employment themselves, and also to provide services like learning how to use a screen reader and different technology around accessibility. So the partnership started actually right when I started with Supermoms. I started in February of last year, so it's been almost a year now. And one of the very first projects that I came in on my first team day up to London was to work with Thomas Pocklington Trust on making our course accessible. So for those of you who don't know what that means, it means that we wanted to make sure that our course was completely accessible, that somebody who is blind or visually impaired could benefit from every part of our course, and that there wasn't anything that they didn't have access to. So we really wanted to make sure that that access was opened up to everybody. So that's where the partnership came from. And Thomas Pocklington Trust put one of their own people onto our course. And here's where I'd like to introduce you to Darren Pascal. So Darren is a blind and a blind trainee himself who came through the program on February of 19 on the group that upskilled over 6 months. And he graduated in July of that year. So our project ran over 6 months. And he's now a certified Salesforce administrator. He's also a technology information champion at Thomas Pocklington Trust. And that was his background. So he is used to testing technology and was really instrumental in our project. He came in every week and provided me feedback so that we could make sure that on our end, we went through all of our course information, that we made sure that everything was accessible as a part of our course. And the great thing about Salesforce is that Salesforce is a product and is fairly accessible itself. We only ever came across one functionality, which was the page layouts, that wasn't an accessible functionality. And that's where many people get into the dev side of things, because they are able to do more around page layouts when you're using something like Visualforce. So that's where some interest in the Visualforce and dev side of things comes with accessibility as well. But as part of the forward-looking statement, this is not to be quoted, but there is talks of projects in the works to be able to replace that page layout functionality with something that is completely accessible. So Darren came through and provided valuable feedback each week. And with his help, we were able to make our entire program accessible, which means not only was Darren able to upskill and become a certified Salesforce administrator himself, but other people behind him are going to be able to do the same thing. And we're going to be able to keep working with Thomas Pocklington Trust to get people onto our program and upskilled and into jobs that have not only accessibility built into them, but also flexibility, because as we all know in the Salesforce ecosystem, there are quite a few remote or flexible positions. And for somebody who is blind or visually impaired, that is so valuable to be able to have those jobs being opened up. So to start us off, like I said, when I came into this project, I was relatively ignorant myself. I didn't really know much about accessibility. I had an inkling, but if you asked me what alt text was, I might have been able to guess at the right answer, but I definitely wouldn't have been able to give you much information. So this was such an experience learning myself and really being able to spread that to others as well. So to start us off, I want to go over what is a screen reader, because like I said, I wasn't sure what a screen reader was before. And that's really a great starting place, because a screen reader is a tool that you're going to be using on your computer. And basically, it does exactly what it says it does in its name. It reads the screen. So what it's going to go through and do is, for any document, any web page, or anything that is really on the screen in front of you that you're able to open up, it reads through the document, it reads through the images, it's going to say when there's an image, it's going to read a description of that image, and it's going to read through all of the text as well. So as screen readers, there's a few different kinds, but they all work in a similar fashion. Usually you would use the tab key to tab from space to space, and you would be able to move around a web page or move around a document that way. So there's a few different options here as well, and they do range from free to paid versions. So there is JAWS, which is a paid version, but it is a very advanced version of a screen reader. So a lot of people have a tendency of preferring this one. This was the one that Darren was using as his main option going through the program. But as with any testing, or anybody who's familiar with the testing world, you know that we like to have options. Just like when you are going through as a Salesforce admin, you probably have all of your different browsers. So if something goes wrong, you can test it in another browser and see if it's a browser issue or if it's coming from Salesforce or something in your org. So the same thing goes for screen readers. It's great if you're doing any testing to have a few different ones installed so that you're able to go through and see which screen reader works the best with your content, and also do any sort of troubleshooting testing that you need. So another one is NVDA, which stands for Non-Visual Desktop Access, and it's from NV Access, and it is a free version, but as I learned out the hard way, it doesn't work on Macs. It is only for Windows computers. So when I switched over to a Mac just before Dreamforce and was trying to download a version to be able to do some screen sharing and some video recording with it, I found out I wasn't able to access this one. And there are also a few others here as well. So when Dolphin, I believe, is no longer exists, but the other ones here do. And there's some links to some Wikipedia information on this slide deck so that you can see that later. So now that I've told you a little bit about the story, how our partnership got started, and what is a screen reader in the first place, that kind of gives us the basics. So at this point, I'm going to share some of the top tips that came out of this partnership and things that we discovered going through and maybe got a little inordinately excited about sometimes. But we were really happy to find some tips and just some different training material that it allows you, us, or anybody else to build accessibility into not only your org, but also your training. And I was always surprised by how easy these were to do. So here, sorry, I'm just going to, there we go. Just jogging my mouse a little bit here. So here, hi everybody. I have two different demos and I'm going to play them both for you. And let me know if you have any trouble hearing them because they are playing through my computer. If not, I will read you the demo with you. And just listen for differences in between the two because one is without narration and one is with narration.
Hi everybody, today we're going to learn how to get our org ID number. So first we're going to click over here and we'll go into our setup menu. So once we are in setup, we just click over here and type in company or company information. We'll go down here and just scroll down here and voila, here it is, our Salesforce.com organization ID. So that is how you find your Salesforce.com organization ID.
And hopefully all of you were able to hear that. Please let me know if you were not. But it was describing how to get to our Salesforce org ID. So that's something relatively easy. It's something that as an admin, we learned that relatively early in the game. You need your org ID to be able to go onto App Exchange. You need your org ID to share it with support if you're using support. There's a whole variety of reasons that you need to know that. But just as a relatively standard example there. And now we're going to listen to a version with narration. And like I said before, just listen for the difference between the two. And that way you can be trying to identify some of those yourselves.
Hi everybody, today we're going to be learning how to find our org ID. So we start in the front end of Salesforce and we're going to be going into setup. So that is by clicking on our gear icon, which is the fourth icon in on the upper right hand side. We'll click into the drop down menu that brings us to setup. And setup will bring us to the back end. So this is where we're going to be spending a lot of time as administrators. We click into the quick find box, which is on the left hand side. And this is where we're going to be spending a lot of our time as admins. So we type in company and it will bring in company information. We'll click into company information and scroll down on this page. On the lower right-hand side, there is our Salesforce.com organization ID listed here. So right next to it, we can see our unique org ID. It's 00D2P501410OT. So it's a mixture of uppercase and lowercase, and that would be your Salesforce.com organization ID.
So that was an example of the narration with, or a demo with narration. So can anybody on this call identify some of the differences in between the two? Anything stand out to you in particular? So that is no problem. I will go through and share some of them with you. So what narration means is that you're telling the story. So narration, it comes from storytelling. So you're not only clicking around and saying, click here. You heard that a lot in the first demo, click here. We go, we click over here, we come down here, we click over here. And if you are able to see the screen and follow along with the mouse in the recording, then that's absolutely fine. You can follow along for the most part. But if you're using a screen reader, then you can see the video recording and you see it as one big block, but you're not really able to see where the mouse is clicking on. You're not able to follow it around. So as soon as you say click here, you're losing the person on the other end. You're losing part of your audience. So it's very important when you're narrating your demos to say exactly where it is that you're clicking. So instead of saying click here, and pointing towards this quick find box, we said in setup, we go to the upper right hand or upper left hand side and we click into the quick find box. That way you're giving the region it's in, they know it's in the upper left. So by tabbing through different components, then the person using the screen reader is able to easily, or at least more easily, find it. Another thing with this quick find is that I also said this is going to be someplace where we spend a lot of time. And that's something that may not be as obvious, but a screen reader, one of the things you're able to do and a really useful functionality of it is to favorite different components on a web page so that when you go back to that same web page, you're able to zoom in very quickly on the top used components in that. So you can basically set up a shortcut so that it goes directly to that when you use that shortcut. So by saying that we're going to use the quick find box very often, that indicates to a person using a screen reader that you're able to bookmark that basically, or highlight it and make it one of your favorites. And that way they are able to navigate back to that quick find box very easily and set up and each and every time. And this is going to be good practice, not only for anybody who's reading using a screen reader, but really for anybody who's viewing your training. Because if you're saying click here, you're not narrating, not saying what you are doing, then even anybody who is on your training, but maybe had to look away for a second. We have moms coming through our program at Super Moms. So there is always maybe a kid in the background or some distraction that comes through, or even that you just are checking an email real quick while watching it. By narrating, you're allowing whoever is listening in and not necessarily looking at the screen and following along for that to be relayed to them. And also, people learn in different ways. So by seeing it and hearing it at the same time, it's sinking in better. It sinks into your brain. It creates more synapses in your brain. And that makes you be able to remember and recall it easier. So it's really important to do this narration. Just for your training, it's going to benefit in general. A few other things we did were to read the numbers instead of just saying, this is your org ID. I read them out loud. So what that does is it allows the person using the screen reader to be able to identify what the correct answer should be. So if they're following along on their own screen, then they can tell if they've reached the correct spot, if they're looking at the correct field, if those numbers match up. So just making sure that you're outlining everything, that you're reading everything as you're going through is really important.
Hi, everybody. Today we're going
Sorry, it's really starting there again. We don't need to listen to those demos a second time. So the next part is around alt text. So narrating your demos is important. And just to come back to narrating your demos first, it is something that does take quite a bit of of effort at first. It is something that isn't necessarily natural if you've been giving demos and just saying click here and not narrating as you're going along, then you may not be used to sharing quite as much. And even for these tabs, if you're going to the third one, you're counting along, all of that is very important. But it's something that at first, when I started doing this with my training, it was constantly something on my mind. I had to think about it. It was something that I had to remind myself to do. And then, as with anything, it becomes second nature. It becomes a habit. So as you're getting used to doing this, you stop thinking about it so much. It starts to become just a natural part of your training. And like I said, it is going to improve your training in general by using narration and really make it so that you're having an excellent demo. So my next tip is around alt text. And alt text, for anybody who doesn't know, is short for alternative text. And it's text that can be added to any image. So if you have an image on a website, if you have an image on your documentation, then you can use it to describe a description. And the alt text will be read by the screen reader instead of that image. So what happens is that if you don't add alt text, the screen reader, it will make its best guess. It will say, well, this is a screenshot. This is an image, but it can't really see what is behind that image or what that image is trying to say. So whenever you're using an image in your website, in your documentation, it's there for a reason and you want to be getting a message across with it. And that's where alt text comes in. It allows you to take that screenshot or that image, that one word that the screen reader would be reading in the place of the image, and it allows you to make it whatever you would like to make it. And that way your message, your point behind the image isn't lost at the end of the day. If you put it there, it's there for a reason. You want to be getting that across. So with your alt text, where you find alt text, first of all, is in Word, for example. You would right click on the image and click on the edit alt text. And it opens up a sidebar. And that's where you're able to add any sort of alt text. There's no limit on it. I know most programs, especially a Word program, will suggest 2 to 4 sentences maximum. That being said, it depends on your use case. So you want them to be as clear and concise as possible, but do make it as long as you need to get your point across. In our training at Supermoms, I've added, I think my longest one was maybe 8 or 10 sentences. It was quite a hefty paragraph to get through, but it was a complicated org chart that I wanted to describe in its entirety. So when you're describing something like that, if you're trying to limit yourself to 2 to 4 sentences, you're not helping anybody. So do make it as long as needed, but err on the side of concise and don't make it too unnecessarily long. You want to be sticking to the point, just as you would with any sort of training document. And then make your alt text as descriptive as it needs to be. And once you've added the screenshot, the image, or the graphic, then it's there for a reason. Make sure that you are describing that reason, that you have the message across of what you're trying to get across with that image. Make sure it's clear and concise, and also set the groundwork for your image. So it's about understanding what that image is in the beginning, and then that allows the description to be even clearer and to be comprehended a little bit faster. So if you're saying, for example, screenshot, and then a colon or a dash, and then your message, then you're letting them know it's a screenshot of your Salesforce instance more than likely. Or you can say screenshot of Salesforce.org. And that's providing that basis for you to be able to get your message across and for the rest of the alt text. The same thing can go for an image. Another thing you can do with alt text is to mark an image as descriptive. So underneath the alt text box, there's a little checkbox and it says mark this image as descriptive. If the image is just there to make it look nice and it's not pertinent to your org or to your training or to your website, whatever it is that you're using as your media, then you can you can be marking that as descriptive, and that way the screen reader just skips over it. It's not going to be reading that. It's not going to be saying that there's an image there. It's just going to move on to the next thing. And that allows for an easier flow of reading from one important message or important sentence or important documentation to the next. So alt text is something that, once again, it takes a little time to work all of that into your training, into your documentation, but it is very important. And we also came across a bonus tip here. So this is one of the things that we might have gotten a little bit too excited about when we found this one out. But with alt text, Salesforce is great around alt text. They already have alt text in all of their documentation. Trailhead is completely screen reader friendly. So why reinvent the wheel? Why, if you are using a image or a chart or a graph that is already exists in Salesforce, then what you can do is use a URL to link directly to that Salesforce page where they already have everything laid out with alt text. So you don't have to be recreating all of that alt text yourself. You can just be linking the URL in the alt text link. And what it will do is it will prompt the screen reader to open that URL, and it will take the person using the screen reader directly to the website. And that is going to allow them to explore a little bit. You may want to say in the alt text that that's what you're doing. You can say, for more information about this image, see this website or see this link, and then provide the link there. But it was a huge time saver because there were some very descriptive graphs that weren't showing up with text, and that was coming directly from Salesforce help documentation. And since it was, we were able to use that URL, test it out, and it worked perfectly. So for any other system or any other imaging that you're using that is already accessible and screen reader friendly, then you're able to use this tip too, and it's a huge time saver. So my third tip is about formatting with accessibility in mind. So this is always what makes common sense to most people, because whenever you're in Salesforce, one of the first things that we learn is about page layouts and how you really want to always be thinking about the customer. That's what Salesforce is all about. It's a great customer experience as well. And it's very customer driven and user driven as well. When we are talking about adoption, we want people to be using it, and we want it to be easy for them to use. And how we do that is to consider the UI, or the user interface, or sometimes you may hear UE for user experience. And that is going to be how the end user, how the customer interacts with the interface that you're using, how they interact with whatever it is you're building. And basically, it's all about the front end of your Salesforce org, or about your training documentation in general and how it comes across. So for anybody who has worked in UI, or even for people who just themselves are looking at this screen here, it looks messy. There is bold up at the top, there's italics, it's changing colors, there's things that are crossed out, there's things that are italics. It's very hard to follow. It loses you halfway through. And it does interrupt the flow when you're reading through anything. So if this is happening with your screen, if you imagine it with the screen reader, what it does is each time that there is a change in the type of formatting, then it's going to take the time to tell you exactly what that change is. So that means that it's going to read through here. It's going to say the header is tip number 3, format with accessibility in mind. And then it's going to say bold, maybe even the font. So Salesforce Sans here. It may say the size of the text, and then it's going to read that sentence. And then when it reads, this may be common sense for many user interfaces, ... then it is going to go again and see that there's another change. So it's going to say italic, that it's in this fuchsia color, whatever that is called. And then it may even be retelling you the text and the font size. So it will really interrupt the flow of the sentence and make it so much longer to read through that sentence using a screen reader because it's going through everything. And it's hard to concentrate too. If you're going from one sentence to the next and trying to keep them straight, but there's a huge pause in between where it's talking about something completely different, then that's making it harder to follow along. So with accessibility, you want to be keeping the formatting relatively simple. You also want to be avoiding any unnecessary images because this is a great image of me at World Tour in London last year with Cody and Astro. I love this one. I'm a big Trailhead fan myself, a little bit of an addict. I like showing it off, but it doesn't really need to be here. It's not doing anything. It's not giving any benefit or any added value to the presentation right now. So why is it there in the first place? And that's just a general rule of thumb, really. But with a screen reader, it's even more important to keep that in mind because unless you're going through and marking it as descriptive, which if you're adding all of this extra stuff in, you're probably not considering accessibility as much as you'd like. So you're probably leaving it and it'll read it as an image. And the person using the screen reader won't really be able to understand whether that image is important or not, what it's supposed to be there for, what it's getting across. It just adds a layer of mystery and incomprehension to it. So avoid those unnecessary images whenever possible. So what should you do instead? Well, instead, you should keep your formatting clean and minimalistic. And this is, like I said, just a general rule of thumb for any sort of training documentation so that you're making it clear and easy to read. But you should be keeping the background relatively clean as well, because if somebody is visually impaired, they may have some sort of sight and they may be using the screen reader as an additional tool. But if you have a lot of imaging in the background, for example, and it's not just a white page or not just a plain screen behind the text, then that makes it harder to discern as well. And that goes for anybody. It's harder on the eyes. It's harder to keep concentrated when you have a lot of imaging in the background of your text. So keep your formatting clean. Also, make use of the headers, the subheaders, and all of that other built-in styling functionality. So this is important. Going back to our example of Word, if you're using Word, there's all of those headers built in at the top. I know I never use those. I would just go through and reformat. I would, if I had a title, then I just make it bold, make it big, and change the color each time. I didn't really use those headers at all. And a screen reader, what you're able to do is navigate between the headers, and not necessarily the first time you're reading through a document, but if you're going back, especially a training document, probably you're going back to it multiple times and you're saying, okay, well, I know I read something about this and it was around here. You'll be able to find it somewhat easily, but you maybe don't know exactly where it is in the document. Well, by being able to navigate through the headers, you can navigate from one header to the next and just go into the section that you need. So by actually using those headers and subheaders, you're adding in an extra layer of navigation for a screen reader. And it's the same idea as sections in Salesforce on a page layout that we'll get to next. But you're able to expand and collapse those. It's that same kind of idea that you're able to collapse it to move through that document a little bit easier and a little bit speedier. So once again, I'm sounding like a broken record here, but make sure your internet images are pertinent and have alt text. So you don't want to have a ton of extra images in here, or if they are in there just for decorative purposes, make sure that you're saying so. Check that checkbox. Make sure that you're marking it as a descriptive image. For example, on this slide deck, I made the slide deck accessible as well, because when you came through at first, it would go through and it would tab through the heading, it would tab through and see that there was an image here. It would call it some weird file name too when I opened it up in the alt text. It wasn't just saying that it was an image, it was giving you the actual file, which was a mix of alphanumeric numbers and letters, and then saying .png at the end, which is not great. It's taking up a lot of time for nothing and it's not really useful. So in here, I went through and I marked this as descriptive. And now when you go through and you're using a screen reader, reading through the slide, you're going to see tip number 3, format with accessibility in mind. It's going to go right to that subheading. What should you do instead? instead of wasting time, instead of adding confusion with an unnecessary image. The same thing goes for this little image of Astro and Einstein at the bottom. Yes, it makes it more visually appealing for your slide deck presentation, and I'm not saying not to use any images, because just having a white slide, it's not quite as fun. You want to be engaging your entire audience as well, but make sure to mark it as descriptive so that the screen reader knows that that's not important here. It doesn't have any major message that is going to be playing with them, that is coming from our presentation and needs to come across. And then our last tip around formatting is to use high contrast text and images. And this is just another one of those things that's a best practice in general. So CSS, for those of you who are not developers, which I am not a developer myself, I am an admin through and through, just dabbling in some coding, some PD1, but I would not say that I'm anywhere close to a developer at this point. So a CSS, I didn't know what this was before, but it is a cascading style sheet. And on a website, for example, everything looks the same. Everything is branded. All the headers are the same. The colors are the same. The text is the same going through the entire website. And this is not done by doing it by hand each time. This is done by uploading a CSS style sheet that controls all of those headers and is basically identifying those headers and saying, well, header 1, it should be in Salesforce Sans with a 22-point size font, italic, in this color blue. And that is going to be applied to the entire website rather than doing it on an ad hoc basis. So the CSS in color contrast ratio. So this is something that is considering the difference between the text and the background should, as best practice, be 4 to 5 to 1 or more. So what this is saying is that you need a certain level of contrast between your background and between your text, between your images, so that anybody who has any sort of visual impairment, whether it may be color blindness, it may be just some level of visual impairment, and just to make it easier and make it easy on the eyes, you want your text to stand out from the background. So if you have orange text on a fuchsia background, that is horrible. When you look at that, it's going to give you an instant headache almost. It's going to be hard to read. So that is where those are too close in contrast. They don't have enough separation here. So that's where you always want to be considering the contrast as well. Typically black and on white, that's one of the highest contrasts, that is the highest contrast that you can have, and it works really well. But as you can see, dark blue on white, it works really well too, and that's because it has this high contrast between the two. So just be keeping that all in mind when you're using your text and your images. You want to make sure that everything stands out, that you're able to see it, and even people who aren't completely blind, who have some level of who can see at some level, are able to view that page and see it a little bit easier. And then our tip number 4 is to make your page layouts intuitive. So here it's important, thinking about your Salesforce org. Previously, we've been talking a lot about the training documentation, and in Word and PowerPoint, what do you need to be doing? So it's also important in your org itself as a Salesforce administrator or developer, whatever your role is, if you are on the back end making any of the page layouts, then you can be making it accessible as well. So like I said, as an administrator, the only thing that we came across is that page layout functionality. And what it looks like for an end user using a screen reader is that it's just a blank box. So if any of you think back, and if you're familiar with the Salesforce org, you can probably see what a page layout looks like. It's that drag and drop tool where you drag fields around the screen to be able to put them in the right order, or the order that you want your users to be seeing them. And for the screen reader, it's just a big blank box. Darren had tried quite a few different tools to be able to see if he could make it work. And one zooms in on certain parts of the website, and he could kind of guess where something should be and where it should go. But it was not ideal. It didn't work every time, and it is not particularly accessible. But besides the page layout, every single thing that was on the admin course or as part of the admin exam was completely accessible. So as an admin, you can be using a screen reader successfully, and as an end user as well. If any of your end users are using a screen reader, or just as a general rule of thumb, because you want to be making sure it's accessible to everybody, and you never know who's going to be using your end product, who may be coming onto the team. So by making it accessible and just making that a habit going along, you're making your life easier for yourself down the road as well. And just opening it up for equality for everybody and for every group. So when creating an accessible page layout, you want to be placing those fields that are the most commonly used near the top of your page. And what that's going to do is, since the screen reader is tabbing through from field to field, the most commonly used ones, you want to have them at the top. And just for anybody going through and using your org, if you're clicking around your org, you don't want to have to be scrolling down. Well, the same thing goes with the tab key. You'll have to be tabbing through a whole bunch of fields and making sure that you get to the right one. So use the most commonly place those commonly used ones near the top of your screen and make life easier for your users. That also goes for components on the page. So if you are commonly using knowledge articles on cases, then you want to be placing that component near the top, and related lists that you may not use as much, that may go towards the bottom. So you want to be changing your page layout. And once again, it goes back to just a best practice, a best rule of thumb. But for accessibility, it's even more important. Also, we mentioned headings and how important they are with when you're creating your documentation. They're also very important in your Salesforce org, because headings and grouping fields together into headings or sections is what they call them in the page layout section, they're expandable and they're collapsible too, which means that if you're not using one, then you can be collapsing that and accessing the next section, the other fields in that are more important to you quicker. So once again, it's making it easier to go by heading to find the area that you need to be in and be able to click directly into that area rather than having to go through 30 or 40 fields to get there. So whenever possible, use those expandable sections and be using headers that make sense, that communicate the point or the grouping to your end user. Also within the section, something that you can do is to choose the tab order. And this is something that I had never really paid attention to. It's one of those functionalities where if you're not using it for anything, you just kind of scroll over it, or you may skim over it. I know I did. And in the section, you're able to go to the right-hand side and click on the little wrench on the section. And that's where you go to change the name of the section. But not only can you change the name, but you can also choose the tab order. So within each section on the page layout, you're able to decide whether you want it to tab horizontally or vertically. So horizontally is going through from field to field, from left to right. It's reading the first column, the second column, if there's a third column, reading that one, and then going to the next row. Vertical is going to read through each row at a time, or column at a time. So it's going to read through the entire first column, and then it's going to go to the entire second column, and then the third, or however many columns you have. So you can see that the order of your fields, you want them to be intuitive as well. And that's where your tab order, you want that to be following whatever sort of logic you're using there, whatever sort of intuitivity that you have built into your sections. So make sure to group those, make sure that they're set up correctly, that everything is there and coming across the way you want it to as an admin. And then our tip number 5 is to test for accessibility. So this is where with Salesforce and with anything in technology, really, you will always want to be thinking about testing. You go through and you build something great and you're really excited about it. You want to get it out there for the end users, but maybe not quite yet. Take a step back and you want to be testing and making sure that it actually works the way you want it to, that it functions the way you want it to before rolling it out to your users and having any disasters. So the same thing goes with accessibility. It's no different. So there's 2 different ways to test for accessibility, and one is for developers. So if you are a developer and writing any code, you can build accessibility directly into your coding. Once again, I'm not a developer myself. I'm probably not the best person to come to if you have any questions about this, but there are some great Trailhead modules that I'll be pointing you towards at the end of this presentation too. So the first way of doing this is to write the test code using built-in Salesforce testing functionality. So Salesforce actually within its Apex code, within its Visualforce code, there's quite a bit of testing functionality in there. And you can look that up in the developer guide and be using some of that built-in testing just to copy and paste a code snippet into the end of your code and have that test code built in, just like you would with any other sort of test code. Otherwise, there are open source options too. And these open source testing resources are ones such as Axe and Linters, and there are others as well. And you're able to use all of these in your Salesforce code also. So that's one way of testing for accessibility. Things that you would test for with code is, for example, if you're building a Lightning component and it has any sort of hover text in it, then you want to make sure that that hover text is showing up for a screen reader. So there is a code snippet that does test for hover text and make sure that that is appearing for the screen reader. So that's just one example of what use case you might use this in. The other way that I prefer, because I'm an admin myself, I like all of the point and click and all of the declarative stuff that you can do on Salesforce. You can do so much and they're always adding more, is to test manually by enabling keyboard navigation. So this is something that you can enable on your computer itself, and by enabling the keyboard navigation, it changes your keyboard into what a screen reader would look like, or it uses the same sort of navigation as a screen reader. So what that means is that we have these different controls, these different keys that are going to be doing different things in your org, and they mimic the screen reader. So tab, for example, it navigates from to the next focusable element. So for example, in your Salesforce org, let's go back to the record detail page. Going from tabbing through is going to go from field to field and be reading what is in each field on your page layout. And that is because each field is reading as the next focusable element. Or it may be going to different components as well to tab through. Shift tab goes back to the previous one. So you can make sure that all of that works. Tabbing is just a really great basic way of making sure that everything works the way you want it to. You can also use arrows to navigate between the related radio buttons, menu items, or widget items. Enter activates a link or a button or submits a form. Space activates a button or a toggle. Escape closes menus, modals, and other popover variations. So especially depending on what you're testing, you may have to use different ones of the different controls and different keys, but you can be testing all of that yourself without installing a screen reader yourself. Another great way, of course, is to download a screen reader yourself, and you can be testing it directly there. But if you don't have the capability, then keyboard navigation is definitely the next best thing. Also, this list is not expansive, so there are quite a few different keys and quite a few that aren't included here that you would be able to use. And this is something that I cannot take credit for myself, this checklist, but I do love it. I like to have it around on my desk, pinned behind my computer whenever I'm doing any sort of training, so that you can easily be accessing it, because it really is just a great way of checking off everything as you're going through and doing your testing. And this does come from Salesforce documentation around accessibility. So the first one is, can you reach every interactive element? As you're going through and testing for accessibility, you want to make sure that you can access everything. And then the second point is, not only can you reach it, but can you activate it if it's supposed to be interactive? So not only do you want to be able to see that there's a button there, but you actually want to be able to click on that button, and you want it to be doing whatever the button's supposed to be doing. And the same thing goes for a URL. You want to be able to not only see that URL and read it, but actually click into it and have it bring you to another website. Number 3 here is, can you focus on elements that aren't interactive? So even if something is static on the page, it's that, once again, it's there for a reason. You always want it to be able to be seen. So for example, if on a page you might have added a rich text field, and it's giving some extra information about ongoing campaigns to your sales users, you want them to be able to see that still. If your sales agent happens to be using a screen reader, you need to be thinking about that as well. So you want to make sure that that screen reader can read that rich text field and all of that campaign information that may be in there. Number 4 is, can you always visually tell where you are on the page? So you want to, when you're tabbing through, you want it to go in order. You don't want it to be going namby-pamby all over the page. So you want to make sure that everything has an order, that it has a sense, that it's arranged in columns, it's tabbing through from one component to the other in the correct order, in the way that makes sense. Does your focus move appropriately when you take action? Does your focus ever move when you don't take action? So not only do you want to be able to click into a button or focus in on a certain part of the page, but you also don't want to be doing your screen reader to be moving around on you when you don't want it to be moving. So you don't want it to be automatically going to the next thing when you need a pause there, or you don't want it to be going to a button and then for some reason clicking over into the other side of the page. So that's number 5. Make sure that it's doing exactly what you want it to do, and that it's focusing exactly where you want it to focus and when you want it to focus. Number 6 is around do hover tooltips also appear in focus? So hover text is very important. You can build it into different components. You can be hovering over the link to another record and being able to see a compact view of that record, which is just a few fields that are useful to be able to see if you want to click into that record or if you get the information you need just from hovering over it. It's saving you clicks, it's saving you productivity. So you want to make sure that all of that is available to the screen reader as well, so that you're saving productivity using a screen reader in the same way. Also, hover text is important when you are, for example, using help text. If you have help text in there, it makes a little question mark next to your field, and it gives you some additional information that allows your end users to know what type of information you want to get into that field. So that's important to be getting across, and you want to be able to make sure that your screen reader can see all of that, and that by hovering over the question mark, they're able to see the rest of the text there. And then, do any drag and drop features have keyboard support? So that's where the page layouts, it's the perfect example. It's a drag and drop. You're taking each field and dragging it to the right spot on the page or dragging it off the page, whatever that is. And it is not accessible. So when you look at it with a screen reader, it's just that big blank box. Whereas something like the lightning pages, you're able, when you're making a lightning record page and using the app builder there, you're able to see all the components to the side, and you're able to drag and drop those components over by highlighting them, clicking them, using the control button to click them, and then using the arrow key or the tab key to get them over onto your page. And then you can still be pulling them to the right place. So that is accessible, and that is a way of making the drag and drop feature work for a screen reader. So it doesn't have to be not accessible, but when you're creating something like that, you want to be making sure that it's accessible and that it's going to have a long longevity there. So that wraps up my last tip about being accessibility ally, and it really was something that almost floored me to some way at the end of our project, just to be thinking back over the last 6 months and seeing how with just a few easy steps and a little bit of time each week, we were able to make our entire 6-month program accessible. And it didn't take that much effort. And if we would have done it from the start, then that would have saved us so much time as well. So that is where now everything that we do, we try to make it accessible. We make sure that we're narrating our demos, that we're adding the alt text, and we hope that we share that with everybody in our organization, and then being able to take this to Dreamforce and on our webinars and to be able to share it with an even bigger audience. We hope that you can use these too. So as a recap, our step 1 was narrate your demos. Make sure that you're talking through the demos, that you're describing what you're doing as you go along. It's going to improve your training in general, and then it's going to make it easier for somebody using a screen reader to follow along too. Add alt text to your documentation. So make sure you're describing your images, that you're adding that in. Step 3 is format with accessibility in mind. So make sure that your page layouts are clear, that they're clean, that you're formatting in a way that is accessibly friendly. Mark those images as descriptive if they're not important. Make sure that you have a good contrast. Step 4 is about our page layout. So make them intuitive. Make sure that you're able to click around the screen the way that you want it to. Everything important is near the top. You're using those expandable sections and grouping all of your fields together there. And then step 5, and near and dear to all of our hearts as Salesforce, being in the Salesforce ecosystem, test, 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 and test for accessibility. You can either do it with code if you're a dev, or manually if you are not, or even if you are. And step number 6 here is one that I hadn't put in before, but it really is the most important one for me, and it's be an accessibility ally. It's great for me to do all of this for Supermoms. It's great for all of you to come here and listen to me today. But the best thing that is going to come out of all of this is to keep spreading it. Go back, talk to your colleagues, talk to the people in your company, talk to your friends, tell them about accessibility, get them all involved, get them all thinking about it. And that's how we're going to spread accessibility everywhere. That's where we're going to make sure that everyone has equal access, no matter what your background is, no matter what sort of tool you're using, if you're using a screen reader or not, that you have equal access to the Salesforce org and documentation. And as you saw, it's a few easy steps that once you build them into your processes, into your habits, it will become second nature. So I hope that everybody here today goes through and becomes an accessibility ally yourself. So as I said before, here are some promised Trailhead modules, and they do have different levels of different levels of Salesforce skills involved, basically. So the accessibility basics, this is my go-to. This is the one I point everyone towards first. No matter if you're an end user, you're an admin, you're a dev, everybody can do this one. The next 3 do involve a little bit more coding. So it's designing for web accessibility, coding for web accessibility, and testing for web accessibility. I would suggest that even if you're not a developer yourself, go through and do these. I did as well. And there are parts of it where to pass the challenges, you're going to have to copy and paste some of the code in or something like that. But there is so much good information around the code as well that anybody from any background can be using. So do go through and learn about what designing is, and especially around testing for web accessibility, because it doesn't only go through the coding side, it goes through all of that manual testing as well. So I would like to thank everybody who came to this session today, and for anybody who's listening into the recording later. And I'd just like to open it up now if there are any questions. I did unmute the microphones here, so I do hear somebody has some festive music in the background. Okay, great. Well, if there are no questions, on the first slide, there was all of my contact information. It's Vicki@supermoms.org. Feel free to email me if you do have any questions or anything else that you wanted to continue this conversation on. And otherwise, I thank you all for your time, and I hope to see you all around Supermoms sometime soon. Bye.